welcome everyone. Within just a few minutes, we're going to go ahead and get started. But before I do, I have to say it's really hard to believe we're at a point in time that we're presenting the fifth and final program on personal finances. I know, of course, this last week as we have gotten ready for tonight's event, I've asked myself many times, where has this last year gone? And so for those of you who are participating for the first time tonight, I want to make you aware that all programs or previous programs have been recorded and are accessible online at www.sdsma.org. Tonight's program will be recorded as well, and we'll also make that available for all members online. In a second here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn it over to Scott so Scott can introduce himself and get started. But before you, I want to encourage all members this evening that if you have questions, please don't be afraid to ask. After all, that's what we're here for. We're a resource for you. What our intent is to be kind of casual here. We're going to keep phone lines open. If we do pick up a lot of background noise, we may go ahead and mute the phone lines just so we can try to prevent that so everyone can hear. If we do that, we'll announce it, and then we'll all stop periodically and check for questions. There will also be a Q&A session at the very end, and so if you have questions, that'll give you another opportunity. And so with that, Scott, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you and have you introduce yourself and get us started.
All right, very much, Mark, and thank you, everybody, for joining. I hope it's the sun is shining, at least it's so beautiful. I hope it was everywhere else as well. But tonight I'm going to take a little time and talk about estate planning. And so my background and my role here currently with the Foster Group is I'm a lead advisor, but I've spent the last 25 years in and around the world of wealth management. So for a while I practiced law, mostly in the area of estate planning and tax. Worked for a while with some regional and national banks and their trust department. I've worked in the investment management field and in the brokerage field. But my mission is I just keep trying to zero in and find exactly where it is that I can help people integrate all of their wealth management needs, whether it's on the investment side, the planning side, or some of these legal things. So again, I have a background as an attorney. We aren't giving legal advice tonight, but I just wanted to take a few minutes and really focus in on what's going on in the world of estate planning. I've called kind of a new era, and that's what we want to cover tonight. So I just want to reiterate before we begin what Mark said, which I really would welcome any and all questions at any time. So there will be time at the end, and I will try to stop, but please, if something comes up, it's a question or a comment, just jump right in, because some of the stuff, can be a little bit complicated, but a lot of it can have just a gigantic impact in people's lives. So we'll just right in, and tonight what I'd really like to do is cover three different things. First, let's just talk about some of those law changes. There's three in particular, and we'll talk about what they've done and some of the opportunities they've created. And because of those three changes, we've seen a wholesale change in the landscape of estate planning. The world now involves these three wealth tiers, and we'll talk more about those. And towards the end, I'd like to really spend some time talking about the things that we look at as being the true goal of planning. So there's a lot of technical stuff about tax law, legal requirements, but too often those things sort of crowd out the most important stuff. We want to make sure we finish with some time to talk about that. Just going to jump right in and get into these changes in the law. And all three of these really came about as part of the American Taxpayer Relief Act of 2012. And that was all part of that fiscal cliff drama up on Capitol Hill. And in fact, the law of 2012 here didn't actually get put into effect until 2013, which kind of reflects how crazy the process was. But look at the results, they were great. The first thing that happened was the exemption amount, which is the amount of money that people can transfer to their heirs without triggering tax. That exemption amount was increased to a base level of $5 million. Not only was it increased, but it's been indexed for inflation. So for the year 2014, each person can go away $5.34 million without triggering any estate taxes. I hope you can all see the slide that there's a chart on the left side showing historically just how big a deal this was. If you go back to the mid-90s, taxpayers or estates were able to transfer $600,000 of assets. In 2002, as part of the Bush tax cuts, that exemption amount was slowly increased. We had sort of the wackiness of 2010 where the entire state tax structure was appealed and brought back. But you can see historically, compared to where we've been, $5.34 million is a really big deal. And of course, with a married couple each having $5.34 million, that allows a lot of families to shelter a lot of wealth. And the estimates today are with higher exemption amounts. You know, we talk about the top 1% of Americans. The estate tax has hit about the top 1 to 2% of Americans. But with these high exemption amounts, now we're even further. Now we're only talking about the top 0.14% of estates will actually be hit with estate taxes, which is a gigantic deal. Another benefit that came out of this, and this is shown on the chart on the right side of this page, is that even after you hit that higher threshold, tax rate will not be quite as bad. So back in the 70s, highest rate on estate taxes was, back in 76, it was actually as high as 77%. But you can see today that has settled in at 40%. So again, this has had profound changes about who will pay taxes, and for the ones who are, for states and taxpayers who are still getting hit with taxes, the bite will still be significant, but not nearly as bad as it has been in the past. Change really is a kind of a continuation of that, and what we're really talking about here is not only did this Taxpayer Relief Act affect the estate tax rates, it affected income tax rates. And so one of the things that we look at is this spread between estate taxes and income taxes. So again, the progression of estate tax rates has gone from 77 to 55% in the 90s, now to 40%. At the same time, we've seen long-term capital gains rates, which used to be 15%, are now looking at 20%, and actually with the Medicare surcharge, are getting closer to that 23.8%. But we're seeing a convergence of those two tax rates. That's a big deal because for the last almost 20 years, estate planning has been practiced as sort of a one-trick pony. The whole playbook was designed around one premise, which is save federal estate taxes, find ways to get stuff out of your estate so that you don't have to pay these taxes. Well, today, one of the things that has the estate planning community up in arms is the world of planning is now much more complicated. Now we're going to be doing a lot of this stuff, and we'll talk about this in some of the coming slides, but generally what I tried to show here is this idea of a cost-benefit analysis, or really weighing the impact. On the left, we're going to go through some examples to show how we calculate what is the estate tax impact of making some decisions. On this is what would be the income tax, or more specifically, what are the capital gains impact of these decisions. And that's a time where planning is going to be all about weighing these two things to decide where are the net benefits. That's a new thing for the world of estate planning, and it really just sort of foreshadows that a lot of things that used to be pretty simple and straightforward, now in the world of at least of tax-driven estate planning, things have just gotten a whole lot more complicated. So the third change that really comes in, luckily helps kind of diffuse some of that complication, and that is this concept of portability. And portability, we'll talk in more specifics about it, but generally it's just a much better way for married couples to share those exemption amounts. Under law, it was often the case where a married couple might have enough tax exemptions to be able to pass their wealth to their kids without triggering tax. But because of a few tax traps, and we'll go through those, it turned out that people were unnecessarily paying taxes. So portability has been something that's new, and it's now in the tax code to stay, but it allows married couples to have a much better chance of missing the tax traps and being able to transfer that full $10.68 million without getting any of the tax liabilities. So those three changes, as I said, have had some profound implications, and the biggest of those is now really the estate planning world is really divided into kind of, I call them three tiers, but there's really three different segments based on these exemptions. So for what the industry, they talk about smaller sized account or estates, that would be up to that one exemption amount, so that $5.34 million today. In that tier, there's a playbook there talking about one set of strategies. In this middle tier, which is in that 5.34 to $6 million, a whole new set of strategies make sense. And then, of course, there's this top tier for estates over $10.68 million, and not surprisingly, the rules here are even different still. So when we look at those three tiers, one of the things that's important is to remember those tiers are indexed for inflation. So this chart that I put together just really shows if we saw inflation proceed at a rate of 3% per year over the next 30 years, you can kind of see what impact that would have as far as where these wealth tiers are. And I think that going forward, the world of estate planning in this new era, one of the first questions you're going to hear from an attorney or an accountant is going to really trying to figure out where exactly do you fit. And one of the things that we're talking a lot about is it's not just the question of where do you fit today, but down the road. So we're talking about wealth trajectories, which is working with clients to say, all right, here's how much money you have today. And this line really just shows someone who's kind of just starting out in their practice. They've got some money, they've put together a bit of a nest egg, but they've got several years before retirement, and they continue to grow their wealth through savings and accumulation in their retirement plans. This person who kind of starts in the lowest wealth tier, over time we can see down as they get closer to retirement, they're actually going to cross over the threshold, and that has important implications because when you fill out, when you put together or execute your estate planning documents, they take effect immediately. They also stay in effect until you die or revoke them, which means so we put together today has to make sense for today's circumstances, but have to be at least you have to have a rough idea of what the future looks like. And so this example of someone who's a younger worker, we also just put in an example of someone who's closer to retirement, who's put together, they've built a larger nest egg. They're seeing kind of in the middle, that middle wealth tier. But over the next 10 years, as they continue to accumulate in their peak earnings years, they're going to have to cross over into that highest wealth tier. And as they retire, their wealth will sort of plateau and over time deplete, bumping back down into the middle and maybe into the lowest wealth tier. So these trajectories, or this idea of understanding in this new era, where to fit in with the idea we need to know where it is today and where it's going down the road. Because, as I said, unlike the old days, rules now are different depending on which tier you fit into. So this table is really trying to show, in the world, as I said, the rules were reduce federal estate taxes. And how to do that? Well, the primary strategy was pretty simple. Just get assets out of your estate. And when we talk about the timeline, what I'm really saying is kind of down at the bottom. When we thought, say, a married couple, do we be doing our work, some of the gifting programs and things, while both spouses are alive? Do we want to wait until one spouse dies, or do we want to wait until both spouses end up dying? So this is the beauty of all these estate planning presentations. You've probably heard some in the past. We always take turns killing off each other, the spouses, in different orders, and that's our idea of fun. But really, the reason we have to kind of go through all these calculations is today, especially, it's in the details, and we really are at a point where there really aren't any general rules of thumb. We need to do the work, and here again is the reason. For estates over $10 million, the playbook is pretty much the same as what estate planners have been working with for the last 20 years. Things out of the estate, there's all kinds of great tax law and strategies that have been perfected over the last several years. But this, and the big thing that's happened with the change in law is idea of in the middle tier. Things actually are sort of through the looking glass, if you will. We're no longer worried about federal estate taxes. Now we're focusing instead on reducing capital gains taxes. In this world, the playbook is exactly the opposite. No more are we trying to push us out of somebody's estate. Now, because we want to take advantage of what's called the step up in basis, most efforts are designed to keep assets in somebody's estate. Most of the work here is not being done during the lifetime of the two spouses as they live their life. Most of the planning opportunities here really arise after the death of the first spouse. That's a whole different playbook, and as I said, the estate planning community is sort of up in arms and scrambling to ramp up their services because as I said, we've been spending years and years trying to get assets out of an estate. They're stuck with this idea, how do I get things back in? So that's been kind of what's keeping everyone busy there. When we get to the under $5 million estates, what we find is the tax-driven kind of motivations to do all this stuff really go away, because at $5 million, you're still $5 million for married couples at least, away from the tax threshold. And so here, one of the good things is tax issues can take precedence. Now, our argument would be, and talk about this again at the end, non-tax issues should probably be taking precedence everywhere, because too often people are guilty of letting those tax tail kind of wag the dog. Nonetheless, what really drives planning in that smaller space is finding ways to ask some questions without having to be driven by the big tax bills that can be either hit or saved maybe. So we'll just take a quick run through each of these three tiers, and we'll start in the top tier, the $10+ million. I spend a lot of time here because, again, this has been the world for the last 20 years. And so people in this area, you know, of course, their concerns are dominated at 40% federal estate tax level. One of these here is most people in this area have some good advisors put together. Really, one of the big things that seems to be more the case is a law gets more complicated. The need working with specialists in this area, the reasons for that just continue to multiply. Now, most people in the medical profession, you understand this better than most. We just see so many people who try to do this themselves, or they work with their attorney who's just sort of a general practice person or an accountant. And sometimes that works, but again, because of the complexity here, our recommendation would be to strongly look at your team of advisors and tap into specialists as you need them, because again, a little bit of work at 4% tax rate can make a big savings, or the other way to look at that is a little bit of a mistake here can have a pretty hefty price tag. So when we talk about how do you get assets out of an estate, well, we kind of the techniques. This again has been done over time. We can give money to charity, we can give money to our heirs before we die, or we can some of these discounts and all that kind of stuff that is donated the world estate planning the last 10 years. But what I would do is just walk through some of the basics quickly and then move on, because again, I think this is probably pretty familiar turf. When we talk about your total estate, we're really talking about everything you own. That investments or retirement plans, a home, farms, cars, artwork. The one that most people often forget is life insurance. So many physicians who start in practice, one of the best first decisions they can make is go out and get some life insurance to protect earnings power over the years. Well, generally that's going to be some $1 to maybe $5 million of death benefit. That all count towards your total estate as far as the IRS is concerned, unless you do some additional planning. So the big bucket we first start with is just throwing everything in to total up how much money you currently have. And then we go through these, we call them the death scenarios of what happens. Well, this was actually based off of a client that we worked with. They had been aggregating some farmland over the last couple decades, and were quite surprised with the run-up in farm prices to find out that they shot right through that tax threshold. And so they were sitting with an estate of $14.5 million. At the time we started working together, they hadn't made any commitments to charity. That's in a first bucket towards the bottom. But if we just sort of kind of walk through what would happen if they were to die, I'm sure you guys have seen stuff like this, but $14.5 million, they could first pour out, using their exemption amounts, $5.34 million each, or a total of $10.68 million, which would then, that the remaining amount, that $3.8 million, is what we call a taxable transfer, subject to that 40% tax rate. So as you know, the sticker shock here kicks in because this family was looking at having to write a check for $1.5 million. We talked about some of their charitable interests, and again, this is pretty much standard playbook stuff over the last two days. But you know, they had taken one of the farms that they acquired. They thought about using to endow some. They wanted to do with some missions and some scholarships. If they moved $2 million of their estate into that charitable bucket, they got to use the value of their full exemption amount, so that $10.68 million, left only $1.8 million to that taxable bucket, and a 40% tax rate that significantly reduced the affected estate taxes. In fact, in this case, we saved in $300,000. So I'm sure you've seen a lot of this kind of stuff. It hasn't changed that top wealth tier. I want to focus now sort of outside of the charitable arena and think about what's going on when it comes to saying, I'd like to give maybe some money to charity, but I really want to focus on, should I be giving money to my kids now, or should I be waiting until I die? Those kind of questions. And back to this timeline. So what we're going to look at is back to the tax trade-off, where during lifetime, mom and dad have some excess wealth they want to transfer to their kids. What's the best way to do that? And as I said before, this isn't as easy as it used to be, because as those tax rates, the estate tax rate now moving down to 40, and the capital gains rate kind of moving up now to that 23.8% number, some of these tax costs of doing things, we're going to go through and just pencil to paper and work through these. So we just give an example of, in this case, there's another farm that's worth roughly $2 million, and mom and dad would like to give that to the kids at some point. And so the question is, should they give this to their heirs during their lifetime? Or maybe saying in another way is it better for mom and dad to give it now or die owning that in their estate? And so you can see in the first column the estate tax implication of giving away, and I'm kind of simplifying here, and we're just talking about there's different strategies about how to do that. But if we can get that $2 million out of the estate without triggering any taxes, $2 million times 40%, we save, or we end up not paying any estate taxes. You compare that versus if my dad died owning that farm in their estate at the 40% tax rate, $2 million is going to require them to pay $800,000 to the IRS. But we don't get to stop our analysis there anymore. Now we take a look at the income tax considerations. And so this is where we get into this notion of the step-up basis. And more specifically, what we're saying is, look, if this farm is worth $2 million today, my dad would have been able to sell it for $2 million today. The IRS would tax them by saying, how much has this grown during the time you've owned it? Well, in this case, years ago, mom and dad paid about $500,000 for the farm. So it has grown in value $1.5 million. The capital gains rate tax in this case is 20%. So the farm comes with it at mom and dad's level a $300,000 pending income tax liability. If mom and dad give a farm to their kids, mom and dad's lifetime, under the tax law, that pending income tax liability gets inherited right along with the property. The other column, though, we see this happens when we use this, what's called the step-up in basis, and you may have heard about this, but it's the idea under the tax law, which is a little bit of a quirk, that says if you die owning an asset, the IRS allows you to reset that cost basis amount to the fair market value of the property on the date of your death. In other words, you get to wipe away that $1.5 million of appreciation, which means you get to wipe away $300,000 of taxes. In a new era of estate tax planning, we've got to go and run numbers and look at each of these situations and say, okay, well, we can either give it away, which is going to mean that we're still on the line for the capital gains but not the estate taxes, net cost of $300,000, or we could not give it away, but that's going to cost us $800,000. So as we go into this world of using those scales of bouncing back and forth what's the right decision to make, we're going to be in a spot where, as I show with this, the scale would say, well, we still go ahead, the estate tax savings still outweigh the capital gains cost, but they take what was otherwise an $800,000 benefit and kind of made it down to about $500,000. So still a good thing, but it's important to be looking at kind of both dimensions of this and do these cost-benefit analysis. That simple example kind of glosses over some of the things that really make this stuff get a little bit complicated, because part of this is what is the stuff worth today, what will it be worth down the road. And so some of this math is part of our new era, and again, this is part of what estate planners are really working hard to ramp up, because in the past, these kind of calculations, some of which can get a little bit complicated, are not part of what attorneys and accountants were delivering. And so today, we are going to start talking about, does this gift make sense? Well, maybe it does as long as you live for 11 years. Or maybe we talk about these gifts make sense so long as farmland continues to appreciate by a certain amount. But these quantitative calculations of what does it take to make this break-even sort of work for us are here to stay, and will make this a little bit more complicated. But again, the opportunities are pretty rich. So when we talk about this top tier of wealth, really talking about, just in summary, getting out of your estate, making during your lifetime. The idea is most generally the estate tax savings is going to dominate any kind of step up in basis. So getting stuff out really seems to work, and in this sort of scales or teeter-totter theory, generally the estate tax world wins. What I do is we're going to shift gears really quickly now to the middle tier, see how different that is. But I'd like to take a moment, because I did kind of buzz through that, and just take a second to see if anybody has any questions thus far. I'll just plow right through this, because the next tier, as I said, when you look at what's going on here, a couple changes. Number one, we're moving on the timeline, and number two, our strategy is the exact opposite. Here we're working to keep assets in the estate. We'll preserve that step up in basis, and so this is maybe more than you wanted to get into, but the idea would be, how do we do that? And the mechanics of that really come down to two basic philosophies. So if I die, I really have two strategies of how I can have my assets go. One of them we just simply call the I love you planning, which just says I have everything I own outright to my spouse. She gets everything. In the old world, everyone likes that theory because it's flexible. There's no cumbersome trust structure. It's pretty simple. But again, in the old world, sometimes that resulted in suboptimal tax situations. Portability is going to solve that. We're going to talk about that just really quickly. The alternative that was developed over the last 20 years is this thing called bypass planning. And I guess that many of you have estate plan documents that incorporate this. But the idea here is, rather than me saying when I die, I'm just going to give everything to my wife, if I'm worried about estate taxes, I create what's called a bypass trust, a family trust, or some people talk about A-B planning. But the idea is to create a temporary holding tank, essentially, this trust that the wife can benefit from while she lives, but ultimately the trust will pay out to my kids. But the important part of this little game is to make it so that the assets in my trust don't qualify as for inclusion or to be included in my wife's estate. The whole idea in that one is, this goes back to those two strategies. Do I want to keep assets in wife's estate? That follow the I love you planning. Do I want to get them out? That's where I'd be looking at the bypass planning. And this again is maybe an oversimplification, but I wanted to walk through some of the implications of what this is and how it's driving planning today. So this chart is a lot going on, but let's just walk through a situation of a couple who has $8 million, $4 million split evenly between both of them. And so our wife Diana dies. She owns $4 million. And her death, using the I love you planning, she gives all of her wealth to her husband Charles. It allows married couples to give an unlimited amount of money to each other, but the kick here is this marital deduction is not a way to avoid taxes, it's only a way to defer taxes. So Diana gives her $4 million to Charles. One of the things that we see that's very different, and this is right at ground zero of the power of portability, because those assets get deferred, at Diana's death, no taxes will be due. That means that Diana doesn't need to use any of her $5.34 million exemption. And this was the tax trap that caused all kinds of problems over the last 20 years. Before portability, if you didn't use that exemption, you lost it. In this case, under the old tax world of, say, 5 years ago, this plan would be very, very bad because Diana would end up not using her exemption amount, and Charles would end up with all of the assets, but his exemption amount to shelter them. And again, under the old world, that meant they would unnecessarily be on the hook for $1.6 million worth of taxes. He solves that because going forward, we're out of this use it or lose it world, and so if Diana doesn't use any of her exemption amount, or even she just partially uses it, Charles will have access to whatever's left. So let's just kind of fast forward through here. When Charles dies, he ends up with the $4 million he started with, plus $4 million. So he's got $8 million to pass to their children. But the big difference, of course, is now Charles can use Diana's unused exemption amount. So he can start by putting $5.34 million, get out of his estate without triggering tax. That leaves $2.6 million that he's going to have to shelter with his own $5.34 million. And we're back to what we all intuitively want to see out of the tax law, which is if you've got $10 million worth of exemptions and $8 million worth of taxes, you shouldn't pay any estate taxes. And again, those tax traps that were triggering that $1 million tax bite were really just a tragedy, but portability really allows us to miss out on that. So I would just summarize kind of this theory about portability, saying it brings the best of both worlds. It allows married couples to give outright to their surviving spouses all the assets. We don't have to create this cumbersome trust structure, but it allows us to also get the tax savings, the estate tax savings that was unavailable before. And so I'm going to kind of fast forward through a little bit of this stuff and talk about how do we get the portability, how do we put this into practice. And quickly, the idea of portability requires an election. It's not an automatic thing. That election has to be made on a 706 estate tax form. Historically, people who say, like in Diana's case, $4 million, where they did not owe taxes, they wouldn't bother with the time and the expense of filling out the tax return. Well, as we saw in this case, it's going to be very valuable for people, especially people in that top tax bracket. We're looking at a 40% tax rate. If you got the ability to use that exemption, that at plus $1 million at 40%, the value of making this election can be up to the $2,136,000 of tax savings. So in cases, planners are advising people, if a spouse dies, even if you don't think that there's going to be an estate tax due down the road, you may just want to go ahead and file and preserve things just in case, like our client that was buying farmland, or maybe you're playing the lottery, or who knows what it is. But as things happen, you get a one-time chance to make this election. Again, if you miss out on about $2 million worth of potential tax savings. So that's a big key about portability. The other thing I would just mention is portability, as it's put together, works great for traditional family situations. But of course, the demographics show that more and more we've got situations where spouses remarry, or we have blended families. In those cases, we can have some particular situations. So going back to our friends Charles and Diana, if Diana dies, and at that point she would be considered by tax law Charles's most recently deceased spouse. If Charles later remarries Camilla, he's married, but Diana is still by tax law considered his most recently deceased spouse. So in our example, if Charles remarried Camilla, he still has access to Diana's exemption amount. The challenge here becomes, what happens if Camilla dies before Charles uses Diana's exemption? And the answer is, if Camilla dies, she now becomes Charles's most recently deceased spouse, and all of those the ability to shelter all those taxes from Diana's exemption amount are gone forever. So again, that situation, planning would say maybe do some lifetime giving, find some ways to use that before an unexpected death may cause you to lose it. The other interesting things in the blended family situation, there's going to be a white paper posted that goes through some of those because they get a little bit complicated. But just the thing to remember here is portability is great, but once we get sort of off the beaten path of traditional families, the application can have some unexpected results. What I want to do is kind of talk about a couple situations where portability, which I keep talking about, is one of the greatest gifts from the tax law. But even still, there's a couple situations where people may decide, you know what, that sounds great, but I'd wind back the clock and go back to our old trust structure, because in examples here, there are exceptions to the general rule about the benefits of portability. And this all comes back to this idea of the tax trade-off. And so in our little picture, talk about in this middle tier, generally the capital gains savings tilt the scales in favor of using portability and keeping assets in an estate. But what we're going to show here is that with situations like highly appreciating assets, so perhaps it's farmland or a stock that's on fire, or a piece of real estate that maybe is going to be used for development, but sometimes some assets are growing so fast that by gifting now, we not only gift the value of the asset today, but that future appreciation. Sometimes that appreciation rate is so high, it can tip the scales kind of in favor of going back to the idea of getting things out of the estate. But another thing that I thought was kind of interesting, down at the bottom we talk about state death taxes. One of the other things that's getting the estate planning community up in arms is that we used to mostly focus, or almost exclusively focus, on the world of federal estate taxes. Today we really have to get in and take a hard look at state death taxes. And of course what that really means is we have this whole new layer of complexity, because as you know, the states have very different laws. So I kind of use an example of, I'll just skip ahead to it, of say a physician in his or her family who are living in South Dakota today. South Dakota, as you know, doesn't have any state income tax, doesn't have any state taxes. So generally, their estate planning documents, if we kind of said, what's the perfect fit for them? Well, now, using 100% portability, keep everything in the estate up until the point that you kind of cross over that $10 million tax threshold. That portability planning right now would be the best, most optimal mix. But let's say this physician decides or gets an opportunity to take a new position in the state of Minnesota, so they just move across the border. Well, in the world of estate planning, guess what? While they get relocated and get acclimated to their new job, somewhere there they need to be doing some thinking, because the state of Minnesota, unlike the state of South Dakota, is going to tax on a state-level death tax. And the state of Minnesota is going to tax you on transfers in excess of $1 million. So going back and doing your planning, what you would find is you need to add this bypass trust structure, and the first $1 million of transfers go through the bypass trust to get assets out of your estate. The assets on top of that, you'd want to invoke the portability regime and keep the rest of the money in. That's the thing that's too tricky, but guess what? Let's say this physician gets another position and she moves to Illinois. Some kind of tax structure there, but in Illinois, the exemption amount is not $1 million. You get past $4 million for free. So now the documents would need to be modified to say, all right, let's pass the first $4, not the first $1 million. And then being sick of all this stuff and maybe some cold Midwest winters, let's say that this couple decides to retire to Florida. Well, now back to a state that has no death taxes, no income taxes, and probably it makes sense for them to go right back to a 100% portability model. My point with this is to really show you layers of complexity and how different this is from the way things used to be. I think what all that stuff really cries out for is the importance of building flexibility into your planning. So we've been talking about these two strategies of how you can pass assets, whether it's portability or using the bypass structure. And my guess is if we all had copies of our estate planning documents out right now, there's probably some mix, but I'm guessing that everybody's got either portability already plugged in, or portability, by that I mean the I Love You planning in their documents, or they have the bypass structure in their documents. The prediction is in the next 5 years, what we're going to find out is everybody's going to not have either one or the other. They'll only have both. We'll end up with two parallel systems because as we kind of went through, as we're skimming the surface of this stuff, the rate of appreciation makes a big difference about which way you should decide to have assets flow. The state that you're in when you die makes a huge difference of whether you should pass assets all to your wife or not, or to your husband. All these things are unknowns at the time that the documents are drafted. So it's very important to put together documents that can preserve these elections down the timeline so that some of the things like taxes, or the actual rates of return, the order of death, all of those things actually play out. So good planning is going to require some drafting so that we can preserve, so that whether it's the surviving spouse or the executor, someone has the ability somewhere down the road to be able to elect what assets flow in which direction at what time. So flexibility is going to be very important in this middle tier. And again, most of the work that's going to be done here is trading off estate taxes for capital gains, but in this area, the capital gains will win. And so our approach is, how do we find ways to keep assets in the estate, or even find ways to say, here's some assets that maybe the last 5 years you've worked and you're planning to get out of the estate. Maybe it makes some sense to put them right back in again, and there's some calculations that need to be done to see if that makes some sense. Take another break here for just a second, because we're going to finish up with the idea in the smallest wealth tier, the area under $5 million, where tax considerations really trump the equation. Again, if anybody has any questions about anything covered or just a question in general, just let me know. So let's just kind of finish up here. When we talk non-tax considerations, these are the things that are making decisions about. Traditionally, we've talked about the world of how do we avoid probate, what do we do with powers of attorney, and I think the planning community has done a really good job of making sure these things are taken care of. There's a lot of other things that can be talked about. What do we do with minor children or beneficiaries who have mental or physical disabilities, aging parents, asset protection? How do we make sure our assets don't get by potential future creditors? There's a lot of work being done in the area of diminished capacity. But again, these are new things, and in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over them to go to an area that I, at least personally, find to be really intriguing. You know, look at all this stuff. We just spent the last however many minutes kind of working our way through the world of estate planning and taxes and all that. And unfortunately, too often, as I said before, all those facts start to squeeze out the time we have to spend on really important stuff. And so, I'm sure all of you have heard the thing about shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. In fact, doing some reading just a while ago, and actually it's interesting. In China, they have a version of this. In Western Europe, for years they talked about clogs to clogs in 3 generations. But the idea is this almost force of wealth destruction or almost entropy that says somebody actually start working in fields or doing some kind of manual labor, figure out some way to start accumulating and acquiring and creating wealth, which allows the second generation to live a better life. The third generation comes in a world where suddenly now things are pretty good. They don't have the same work ethic as Grandma and Grandpa may have had. Some commentators have crafted this word called affluenza, and the idea is what happens when kids grow up in this world of excess financial wealth? What does that do to their development? What kind of impact does it have socially and on some emotions and some of their, I guess, really character issues? When we look at all the things that impact the ability to transfer wealth across generations, first and foremost, the track record is awful. 70% of the time when we're transferring wealth over the generations, we fail. And hours and tens of thousands of dollars drafting all these really great estate documents, and we talk and spend hours and hours managing the investment portfolio or the business that's doing all this. But unfortunately, what we're finding is not enough work is being done to combat what ends up being the biggest way that wealth gets destroyed, and that is the ability for these heirs to be able to receive all of this wealth, that it can be a benefit, not a burden to them. So I'd just like to finish up with a couple ways that we think you can help kind of combat the odds here. So the first thing we think that needs to be done is really to change the way we think. And the part of that is the importance of letting children struggle. And I just recently heard the story. I'd never heard it before, so maybe it's not new to you, but it really seemed to contain a lot of wisdom when I heard it. And it's this idea that when our butterfly is getting to emerge from the cocoon, apparently it's a pretty difficult process to watch, because what happens is, the butterfly works to kind of gnaw a small hole in the cocoon and struggles and thrashes around and works for hours trying to get itself out of the cocoon. Different times, supposedly, over this time, the butterfly would just kind of remain motionless because it's totally exhausted, then it'll try again, wear itself out, and continue to try. In this process, a well-intentioned onlooker may come in and say, well, I want to see how this butterfly does, so they may cut or peel open the cocoon, and amazed to see that what comes out is this loaded, kind of misshapen butterfly whose wings are small. They're not this vibrant orange and black that we're used to seeing, because precisely the struggle of getting out of the cocoon that takes a lot of the necessary fluids that are in the abdomen of the butterfly. It its way out of the cocoon helps force a lot of this fluid into the wings, which allows them to be able to be healthy and thrive. And so helping and sort of short-circuiting that very process, what you end up with is a butterfly that doesn't fly, and ultimately a butterfly that doesn't live very long. I heard that, I kind of take a hard look in the mirror, because I think all of us have really good intentions about how we can help our children, how we don't want them to have to go through some things that we went through. We want them to kind of have a step up. Actually, what a big part of that 70% failure rate is driven exactly by this idea of the importance of, you have the ability to help children out with maybe that first house or car or college or whatever it is, but be really intentional about, are you really helping? By sidestepping the struggle, are you actually contributing to this problem of affluenza, or again, working against this shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves curse, if you will? Other ways that we can help prepare heirs and fight this curse is to change the way we think about money. So that is, in Economics 101, they teach that money is a medium of exchange and a store of value. But see what I think some of the insights that can be, you guys have spent a tremendous amount of time learning, of practicing, of training, and now working with patients over the years. The economics of that work is all of that good, hard effort is stored in things like your retirement account balances or your personal portfolios or whatever your investments might be. Think of those things not as value in themselves, but really sort of like this is the storage tank. We want to convert those two. As we think more intentionally about, I did all this stuff for a long time, what was the purpose of it? Was it so I could enjoy a really great retirement? Was it to help those kids, help maybe people outside of my family, help maybe grandchildren with education? What's the purpose of that? And the other part that we want to focus on is expand the definition of wealth. Wealth, and at least I do, immediately just jump to money. But there's so much a part of family wealth that when we ask our clients, how do you define wealth? Everybody always says things like a good family, relationships, but when you look at their actions, too often things like education, experiences, abilities, care, those kind of get left behind. So part of the way we can beat this shirt sleeves to shirt sleeve is to be more intentional about what exactly is wealth. And then I also need to be intentional about thinking about time. How can we think about that different? Because we all, it's like in the investment world, Wall Street thinks 90 days is long term. But the truth is, if we're talking about generations long, we're talking about a 50 to 100 year decisions. And so I think the right there is this idea of planting trees. And if you're planting little seedlings today, you never see the person who ultimately benefits from this. But time is the most valuable resource in the world of estate planning. Often people are looking at this short-term horizon when we need to be stretching it out to much longer decisions. This is important for mega wealthy, but I think it's equally important for families who have more modest amounts of wealth. Really, I think it's important to be this curse if we really rethink this idea of which generation are you. A lot of commentators will talk about, regardless if you inherited some wealth or where you are, take the approach that I'm now the first generation. I'm going to be creating wealth. It may not be the financial wealth, but I'm always going to maintain that idea of growing wealth as opposed to living on the wealth, which unfortunately kind of starts the downward spiral to cause a lot of the problems that contribute to that 70% failure rate. The other thing I would say on this is also to change the way we think about communication. And again, I keep saying this about being more intentional, but when it comes to communicating about money, too often it's seen as a taboo subject. We're going to talk about how much mom and dad make or how much money grandpa have, but that contributes to our problems. And it's so important as well to be passing our values with those dollar values. So find some kind of communication. For some people, it can be just a simple letter that's written to future heirs, maybe even grandchildren or beyond that you may not even know or will ever even have the opportunity to meet. But in some cases, in some families, people are taking a more formal approach and using a family mission statement or philosophy statement to convey kind of the heritage that they feel is important. And as for that process, whichever form it takes, it's really important to share the family story. That really does become this glue that holds generations together. So if work ethic, for example, was so important, and somebody, whether they came to the United States or through the GI Bill or whatever it was, share that story, because that really creates powerful connections, powerful roots to help future generations, again, avoid or at least minimize the likelihood of that sleeves curse. I would also then talk about, for our clients that we work with, it's one of those things that, especially as we get either towards or into retirement, one of the things that I've found is there doesn't seem to be too much of a gray area. We talk about all these ideas of being intentional and how can you do some of this stuff. It really applies at kind of these two levels. What are we to prepare our heirs? But there's also just sort of this concept of what are we doing in terms with the mom and dad or grandma and grandpa or whoever it is, because I think all of you, I'm sure, have seen people who worked like crazy during their lifetime. They hit retirement and now they're actually working harder than ever, but because they're loving it, it's not like work, it's this passion that they have, this idea of finding your calling. We're spending more and more time with our clients on what we call this pathway to flourishing, is saying, again, all this stuff you do, it's a means to an end. What is it? What is it you feel called to do? What is it you're passionate about doing? And then the second layer of this is, for a lot of us who have been blessed, we're stewards of something. So what are we trying to do? What are we looking for as we get this legacy? What kind of generosity is important to us? What kind of impact do we have in the world? We think it's so important that these things not get pushed off to the side or backburnered and have people focus instead on all the tax, legal documents, and all of that stuff. Those are tactics. Those things are important, but they're absolutely secondary. To be able to sit down with your advisor and say, look, before we get all that stuff, here's what I want you to know. The most important thing for me and my family is this. Those are kinds of estate plans where people have huge success. Those are the ones that have the best chance of beating that 3-generation curse. And those are the ones that we just think it's so important that people take a hard look at and spend time and the effort to be able to think through what's important, to actually write that down, to communicate, because we think there, again, the rewards really will play out. For our talk, that's really the three things I wanted to talk about. I want to thank everybody for spending some time tonight, but mostly it'd be great if we have a chance, if anybody has any questions.
thanks. This is Mark. And again, does anyone have any questions for Scott this evening?
Scott, this is Dale Bachwick. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So, the idea of struggle, are there any studies that give some indication as to what optimal times in life, time struggle for your children? In other words, it seems that it's pretty clear that early in childhood that struggle is good. But are there other sort of key times that children should follow, whether it's during college or grad school or early career? Are there any studies that give us answers on that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I haven't seen what I would call sort of academic studies on that, but I've seen some people who are writing, I think just based on their own experience or some of the anecdotes. In fact, about a month ago, I was meeting with a new client, and he had some excess wealth, and he said he intentionally avoided giving his kids money until their 30s, because in his mind, the 20s, that's the time of the struggle. And so that seems to be the consensus, that the time of really getting out, gaining independence, so maybe it's first job, first home, starting a family, those are the pivotal years where I think people learn self-reliance, and I think in my mind, somewhere in there, and again, I don't have any academic research to back this up yet, although I keep looking for some of this stuff, because I think going for this will be a pretty fertile area for this. But it really seems to be those, especially in the early 20s, where a lot of this character development seems to be going on.
Along those lines, emerging data one way or the other about educational debt. The debt that one can accrue during an undergraduate and graduate education is pretty breathtaking these days, and it seems that trying to buffer that to a large extent would be helpful and not deleterious to future development of responsibility.
Yeah, and just again, for me personally, I would just say, in my life, the gift of having help with education has made a tremendous benefit. I struggle with exactly what you're talking about with my kids, because I will give them opportunities they might not otherwise have. But I think the real balancing there is being able to say, all right, how do you do a good job of saying, I'm going to give you a little boost here, but whether it's in the form of loans, which maybe maybe there's some good way of things that we talk about is have a loan from a family member to make this possible, so you're not paying student loans wherever. Maybe down the road, again, maybe in those 30s or somewhere, you start forgiving some of that loan, or even take some of the pay back, that the child has ended up really kind of paying money into a fund, which ultimately they're going to get anyway. But by several years of struggling to make those payments, of having to budget, to find ways to make ends meet, maybe that's a way to get the best of both worlds.
Thank you.
That reminds me of something else that I think is really important, because what we're seeing is, too often in the past, the traditional model would say, I'm really interested in the education, and so I want to help my kids, but I also want to help my grandkids and whoever. And so we'd create all these trusts, and what we were really doing in a lot of cases, even things like incentive trusts, which were really brought out maybe 15 years ago to kind of help not create this dependency on assets, turned out to be really kind of an imperfect fix. What we're hearing more and more is about what are called beneficiary controlled trusts. And the idea of these would be that a trust structure is used and it has some good benefits, and maybe early on, the idea of the trust is, the child just ends up, or whoever the beneficiary is, ends up being able to get access to money when they need it. But there's a timeline that's been created, and over time there's really an evolution. So time, and sometimes little milestones about are they able to pay down debt or get a job and get a promotion in their job. But the idea is using the trust structure not to kind of create this dependency, create a situation where there are some instances as far as financial and professional development to allow them to ultimately go from a trust beneficiary to maybe like a co-trustee to ultimately to be the trustee of their own trust. But through this process, they're earning their way up and learning important life skills all the way through. That's been, I would say, one of the most innovative areas in estate planning that I've seen here over the last couple of years. I think there's a lot of potential in that realm.
Very interesting.
For Scott. Questions. This is Mark. I'm going to go ahead and ask one, and I mean that I'm not alone, but to give you an example, my wife and I have a will set up. I'll have to be honest here and say I'm not so sure that if it was reviewed after the birth of our second child, and so again, I'm assuming I'm probably not alone, but the one I have is how often should a person be taking a look at those types of documents? Then also, what are some of the kind of the key points or milestones in a person's life that you should be looking at that and having them reviewed and or updated?
Great question, Mark, because what we're seeing is the old strategy or the old theory was either have a kid or maybe I'm going on a long vacation out of the country. Well, maybe I better get my will redone. Especially as you start getting into that second wealth tier, we're in a world, what I was trying to show with all these balancing acts and all this other stuff, estate planning is going to be a continuous process. It doesn't need to be a gigantic time burden, but I would say that, if for the reason, remember early on I showed that chart tracking the progress of the exemption amount. If you have documents that go back, 10 plus years, they probably reference a formula of what assets go where based on the exemption amount. And maybe when that was $600,000, the split made perfect sense. But today, when that's $5.34 million, people are frequently stunned at what this says. And a lot of work in estate planning is being done to kind of do some planning after the fact, which I know is imperfect. So I would say, especially if you're in those top two wealth tiers, just have of working with your advisory team, say, hey, we just need to put this on our calendar every year. Maybe we don't need that. Maybe it's every 2, maybe every 3 years. If you're in that lower tier, I think it's important to be really thinking about those non-tax considerations. And there I think you can focus on more things like, the idea of new kids, trying to think about who would be the right guardian. So in my case, I'm guilty of having drafted my own documents a while ago, and I thought it'd be great to have my parents step in if my wife and I died to raise our children. Well, my parents are now in their middle to late 70s, and now that's maybe not such a great idea. And so what that does is leave the door open to potential conflicts about every well-meaning, but what should be the right effect. So I guess back to your question, Mark, I would say if you're in a situation where taxes and all those kind of savings are going to be important, really look at getting a regular, continuous basis of updating. If you're not in that situation, speaking about some of those non-tax considerations, and it's more big, life milestones, weddings, etc., use that as a time just to pull those old documents out, take a look, and make sure that they still make sense.
Any questions for Scott this evening? Okay, so none. You certainly don't want to speak for you, but I know tonight you presented the opportunity that if people did have questions and feel comfortable asking in front of the group, that they could probably, or they could channel those through the Medical Association, and we could forward those on to you. Does that offer still stand?
Absolutely. I'd be happy to help however I can.
Nothing like on the spot. Okay. Well, so if anybody does have questions and they don't feel comfortable asking those this evening, they certainly forward those to myself, Mark East at the Medical Association, meast@sdsma.org, and we will forward those on to Scott, and I know that he's been very good to just answer answer people's questions. And even a couple sessions back, one of the folks from Foster Group was willing to take a look at some folks' documents regarding insurance and planning. And so they've been a great resource, and we thank you for that. Scott, to wrap up, any parting thoughts or words?
No, I just say, first of all, thanks very much for putting this together, and thank you, everybody, for taking valuable time out on a Tuesday night. And I would just reiterate what Mark said. If there's anything, any questions, or any way we can be that resource, please let us, because again, this new era is got some complexity to it, and so a little bit of planning can make a big difference.
As always, thank you very much. We appreciate the energy that you and Foster Group has given us and preparing some of these presentations, and so again, we want to thank you for that. If no questions, we'll go ahead and call it a day, and again, thanks everyone for joining us tonight.
Thank you.